You're listening to Wit in the Word, the podcast where wisdom meets humor, where two friends with one faith dig into scripture to explore how it shapes and connects us. It's a space for insight, laughter, and some wild deep dives. I'm Annie.
And this is Jessie.
And together, we'll uncover how wit in the Word weave meaning into our lives. Let's get started.
Welcome to our 7th podcast. Today, we are going to open talking about what is your favorite dessert.
Ooh, that's going to be a tough one because I like all forms of dessert. I guess if I had to say what I didn't like, can we go there instead?
Sure.
Yeah, for me, it's probably, I don't really like cooked, baked fruit. So,
Like a cobbler?
Yeah, or like pies. As I've grown up, I'm like, I can eat this, but it's not my favorite. But give me cheesecake, brownies, cookies, all the things. I really like dessert.
I would say I have two. Strawberry pretzel dessert that's got the pretzels and the marshmallow and then the strawberry jello.
Even though that does have fruit in it, but I will eat that one.
But it's not cooked fruit.
It's true.
I just like the sweet and the salty. And then I also really like tiramisu.
Yep. And I could also put that in my no category just because I don't
like
coffee. So.
Right. So those are my two favorite.
Yeah, but I do like sugar. So pretty much everything can fit right in there. So that's our fun little get to know us this week. So we are going to go ahead and start our reading. So this week we are reading chapter 4, verses 1 through 12.
Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went and sat down. Boaz then took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all of the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah."
All right, guys. So we left off last week with Ruth visiting Boaz on the threshing floor. And while he's sleeping, she lays at his feet. He wakes up, he sees her there, and she essentially just asks him to be her redeemer. And so we see that Boaz is really willing to do that, but he's aware that there's somebody else out there that is closer relative to Naomi and Ruth. And so Boaz needs to do right by that. And so we see here as we start in verse 4 that that's exactly what he's doing. He's an honorable man again. And so we have in verse 4, Boaz goes up to the town gate. Just as he gets there, this guardian redeemer shows up. But why would he go to the town gate? Let's talk through that.
In biblical times, we have towns or cities, and they're surrounded with walls made of different materials, and then we have the city gates. And they were very important places. They would be the hub in the town for judicial matters, business, social interaction. You'd have maybe what you'd call like your city council kind of things happening at the gate, and it was just a place where people would get together to learn things and share information.
Yeah, so I think what I was, trying to reference, these towns were built with these big walls around them for safety. There was constantly battles and attacks happening all throughout the Old Testament. And so these towns were built with big walls. Think about a town that kind of allows me to think about these walls. They marched around this town 7
Jericho.
times. Exactly. And so that is how the Israelites were able to get into that city, was when the walls came tumbling down, they were able to go in and take it over. And so you can envision that this gate is a place where if you're coming into the city, that's where you would come in. And if you're leaving, that's where you come in. So all of the town business happens as these gates. So it was a very smart place for Boaz to go and potentially find this person. And as we see, this is totally God's plan, because who walks up?
We have the unnamed kinsman redeemer happen to come by, which is just another example of providence in this story, where he happens to be where Boaz is at. Then they all get together, and Boaz gathers 10 of the elders of the city, and they're all going to chat. And so you might be like, well, why 10 men? All right, so 10 men would generally be what you need for a quorum in Jewish practice. And they kind of get that number from a couple different stories. So when Abraham pleads for Sodom and Gomorrah, he basically gets down to the number 10 and says, if there's 10, is that enough to save them? And God says, yes. So 10 in that story is enough to be the community, the collective. And then you have the story of the 10 spies in Numbers 14, where they go out and they give a faithless report, but God calls them an assembly, so that the number 10 would be enough to, again, establish the community, the assembly idea. Also then in Genesis 42, you have Jacob's sons, and the sons of Israel buying food were 10, suggesting that 10 individuals represent the entire people. So 10 is the number that Jewish tradition uses for a quorum for making official decisions.
So it just so happened to be 10 there, very conveniently, the way the script has. Deuteronomy 16:18 does say, appoint judges in all of your gates. And so this is kind of been laid out for them in the Old Testament. So Boaz takes the 10 elders and says, sit here. And so then in his own intelligent way, as I read this, he says to this other potential redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling a piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring this matter to your attention, that there's some land available. Would you like to buy it? And very, very quickly, he says what?
He agrees in front of all of the elders and whoever else happens to be at the gate that this is a great idea. Seems like a good deal. He's like, heck yeah, I'll buy the land. But Ruth hasn't been mentioned yet.
Right, just Naomi. And so, like, in a selfish manner, this just makes sense. But for me, I question why. Because Naomi's mentioned, doesn't she need to be redeemed? And so I had to think through that. And I go all the way back to chapter 1, and it says that she's too old for a husband. And even if she could and had a child, then Ruth, could you wait that long for that child to grow up? And so I'm thinking here that Naomi is not even someone who needs to be married because she can't have children anymore. Doesn't say that specifically, but that's what I'd assume. That's why it's like, oh yeah, I could just buy that land. That would be great because then my family will inherit more land, right?
Right.
Like this is land that nobody is going to possess because there's nobody else to redeem it. So I would assume his family would keep it. But very quickly then Boaz is like, but
if
you buy this,
can't buy back the land unless you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the dead man's wife. And I think this unnamed redeemer, that would be shocking. One, because Ruth is a Moabite, and we know they are a cursed race, that no Ammonite nor Moabite shall enter the presence of the Lord. And also that he will have to marry her and have a child with her because she is of childbearing age, because he says the dead man's wife.
And so then I think you can kind of look at that text, and I don't know why I use Naomi then at the beginning other than just as a point that he's kind of being intelligent in this decision, because we know Boaz actually wants to be the one to redeem her. And so from this point, you can see that it's actually potential that Mahlon is actually the one who inherited the land already. It's kind of passed off. And so then Ruth becomes the one who has to be redeemed, not Naomi just selling land.
Right.
So it becomes more complex. And so he says fairly quickly he can't do it. And he uses the reason he can't do it because it will mess with his inheritance. And so really there's probably 3 things you can think about as to why he very quickly could say, I can't do that. Obviously no longer just benefited him. There's more complexity to it. Number 1 being that maybe he has adult sons and his adult sons have already inherited his land. And so in order to then get married to Ruth and try to have another child, that would mess up all of that inheritance, make things kind of messy. Second off, it could be, as you said, Boaz specifically called her a Moabite. He says, Ruth the Moabite. Is he doing that on purpose?
Probably.
You know, he's okay with marrying a foreigner. He's been treating her really, really well. But for other people, that's that whole uncleanliness. You're not supposed to marry a pagan. And so immediately he's like, no. And maybe that for him was an easy way out. Like, I'm not supposed to marry Ruth. Mm-hmm. And so there's that option. Or third, lastly, it could be that he has a wife at home. And I know in the Old Testament people had multiple wives, but maybe his wife is difficult and he's like, I can't bring another woman into this situation.
Or maybe he really loved his wife.
That could be. He
and
doesn't
was
need
like,
to.
I don't want to make the wife that I love with all of my heart upset by having another wife.
It's true. So potentially 3 options. Regardless, Boaz's proposition causes that man to back down and leaves Boaz as the next in line. Now, one other thing to think about, it doesn't say it, but potentially because of what was going to happen here, what if Ruth and Naomi were present here? I can't imagine how they felt.
Right. It doesn't say whether they are present or not, but that would be an interesting side note. Like, how are they feeling about all of this happening? Are they present and they get to hear like, nope, don't want you?
Mm-hmm. But even first that I'll redeem it. And they're probably like, no, because they wanted Boaz. He's treated them so well. And it really looked like God had this plan and all this was playing out. And then all of a sudden someone else, and you don't know how that person's going to treat you or anything like that. And so then we get to have them have this big sigh of relief, like, oh, I hear you, I don't want you, but in turn it's like, yay.
What is that called when you have, fan fiction? Yeah. We need some fan fiction
a fan fiction.
Ruth and Naomi's feelings about what's happening in this situation.
I know, it doesn't say they're there, but I like to put a little bit of those thoughts into the process.
Well, you like to think about what it would be like if you were in that position, wanting to marry Boaz, but knowing that actually first you have to possibly marry this other person, and what you might be feeling, just to like put yourself inside these biblical stories, because they were stories of real people with real feelings and emotions.
Right. And that this process of like, you can see that Boaz truly loves her and this romantic interest starts to play up until this point and be like, but sorry, you can't have them. It really wouldn't be a great feeling to know you have to just wait patiently. Like, can I be with the person I actually love? Sometimes no. And so we do get to have this collective sigh of relief. He doesn't want her because of the complications. And so then we move on to verse 7. And my NIV version has this in parentheses, and we'll talk a little bit through this. But it says, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off their sandal. And so basically what's that saying? So immediately I have to question, why is this in parentheses? And we have spent a long time trying to figure out why this is there, make it make sense. The one thing I think is that it doesn't fit with the story in the sense that the story can be there without it. You can go through that.
Right. I do think it's a bit of a text negotiation where it was maybe either added after the story was written to make sense for people, or maybe even like by the original writer, they could have added it in later, or another person could have added it in later, so that we can understand culturally that they use this as a way to do transactions, that the original story would have made sense, but then if you're not from that time and period, you wouldn't understand the context.
I know. So then for us, because we are these people who like to deep dive and try to make this, okay, where in the Bible do they talk about when you take off a sandal, when you transfer property and this and that? There's nothing specific other than the Levirate marriage law, which is what we're going to talk about. And so it just doesn't quite make sense why they specifically did it, but Just know that it's there and that this is potentially a cultural practice that even beyond your transfer property with familial ties, it could happen just in transferring of property in general and sale is how I read it.
Right. I think they're trying to say that they used items to physically represent a transfer. And in this case, they're just going to be using a shoe.
Right. And so let's go into verse 8 where it says, So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. And he removes his sandal. And so we do have to talk about why a sandal? What about that causes this transfer of property?
And so the Bible talks about sandals in a lot of different ways that are very interesting. And so one thing is to think about that people used sandals as a way to assert like authority or ownership. We have this story where Boaz is going to redeem Naomi with land in a shoe transaction. Then we also have stories like the prodigal son. He gets sandals, so that's restoring his sonship and his freedom because slaves don't wear sandals. Can it signify this legal exchange, but it also can signify the transfer of other things. And sandals also are an act of reverence, kind of, or removing them, I guess, is the act of reverence, because you have Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3:5, where he's told to remove his sandals. You have Joshua 5:15, where he's also told to remove his sandals in the presence of the commander of the Lord. You have that when you would come to the tabernacle and you were in the main courtyard or the outside part, everybody could wear shoes. But when you went deeper into like the Holy of Holies, the priests were not allowed to wear shoes, and shoes or sandals were not part of the designated footwear or garments. Like if you look at Genesis 28 and the things that they needed, footwear was not in there. So when you're in the presence of God and the holy things, you don't wear your sandal. There was just bigger metaphors, I think, when they're talking about what you would do with your shoes.
And I think, yeah, so the point is that sandals represent something. It's not just like, oh, the guy took a shoe off. It's like, no, the act of a shoe is really important in biblical context. And so that's why I think it is significant in the transfer of property.
I think so too.
You know, so it's like by removing this, it's a symbol that I am making it known to all around that I am handing off my property to the new owner. I'm like, if you're standing on the ground per se, think about that. If I would lift my shoe off, it becomes your property symbolically. So that's what we're seeing here.
While we're talking about sandals, I wonder if you read Harry Potter and they talk about how that's a kind of a mirror of the Bible story, I wonder if that's where Dobby gets like the whole sock thing and ownership is from the same idea of this sandaling.
Oh, I like that. But also, like, them are unique fighting words that people say Harry Potter in the Bible. But I agree with you. The battle of good versus evil, that whole is very similar to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and that representation there. So I would argue that a lot of stuff comes from...
I think you can say that it's inspired by the Bible.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to if you want to say it's not biblical, you can at the very least say it's inspired by the Bible.
Yeah, that battle of good versus evil. And what is the major battle of good versus evil? God versus
Satan.
Exactly. And all the stories that are good versus evil from here to the end of time really are based off of that. That is the original. That's the OG. The only one, really. The one that matters. So I kind of like that. I've never thought about that, though. That's probably exactly what it is. Using clothing as ownership. And so in order to set the house elves free, you had to give them a piece of clothing. So this is here.
Could you give them any clothing or did it have to be a sock?
I think it had to be a piece of clothing.
Okay.
It's just the sock just fit in that book just so. So anyways.
Well, there's that. Okay.
There's our fun fact. We both have enjoyed Harry Potter.
Back to our regularly scheduled content.
Anyways, let's keep going.
And I think that's what then leads us to a little bit of the Levirate marriage law. Is part of that in Deuteronomy 25. It talks about if the redeemer says no, then the person who needs to be redeemed goes and spits in their face and takes their shoe, and then they become known as the family of the unsandaled.
So as like that's where we are trying to make this make sense, because that's not happening. But yet this is that practice where we have Naomi and Ruth needing to be redeemed. And so Boaz wants to do it, but he's not next in line. And so we actually see this taking place, whereas this guy is saying don't want to. So technically Ruth should go up to him, take his shoe off and spit in his face. And we're not seeing that here. We see the actual unnamed potential redeemer take his own shoe off to transfer property. And so that's why we are struggling with this text. And we're trying to, why are they not following that? Why does it look different? And we have some thoughts on it.
I think possibly one option is that when the thing that we were talking about in Deuteronomy 25 and you do the spitting and all of that, that is when it is a one-sided equation where she still wants to be redeemed and he's saying no. So that's shameful. Whereas this seems to be a transaction where both sides agree that Boaz wants to do this. He wants to take the responsibility. So because there is no conflict, we maybe don't have the spitting because it's a mutual transaction, but I don't know.
Right. And
that is just my best guess.
I know. And we don't see her present here. I mean, she could be, like we said, but we don't see her. So she's not doing the actual removing and the spitting. But I think that at least makes it feel good for me to read it that way. But again, not quite understanding why it reads out that way. But I like that it's the fact that there's a mutual transaction and he doesn't have to actually be shamed by being spit in his face. Now we can go back and discuss, though, is he shamed in the fact that he's not even named in this text because he's not really important in the Bible?
I don't know if that's necessarily shame or just if he would have been named, maybe that would have brought shame upon his family. And now, because he's not named, it protects his family from having to be shamed.
Right, to be the family of the unsandaled.
Right, because they're saying
right
this is something that Boaz wanted anyways.
Yes. And obviously it was God's plan throughout.
Right.
And so we get to see that. But, just know we have wrestled with this text a little bit and have done lots of reading. And I can't be like, oh, yeah, go back to Deuteronomy and that's where they do this. It's not there. And so this is our best explanation. Sometimes we just have to be like, I can't explain it. I don't know exactly why it says it, but we still want to wrap it up in a tiny little package for all of you. That doesn't mean we necessarily should. So if you want to argue with us and say that's this and that, we're totally fine with that. We are not saying this is exactly truth here. We're just trying to wrap it up in a package. Maybe we shouldn't.
We're trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense to us the best that we can.
Right, because I would love to be like, and look at, she spit in his face, and this is how it looked, and that's Levirate marriage law from Deuteronomy, and it's like, it's not happening. So that being said, we then see Boaz in front of all the elders. So this is officially official because there is the quorum there that he's saying, I buy the land and all that comes with Naomi, the property, Kilion, Mahlon, and also I acquire Ruth, or as Jesse says, I buy Ruth.
That's not what I say. That's what my Bible says.
I know. It's not, like she said at one point, I need to take off my current lenses of my worldview and be like, no, they did acquire women back in biblical times. Acquire sounds like a much better word.
I know, but it's just that women were property.
Yeah. Whereas for me, we just had this discussion about how I'm like, well, no, he bought the land and therefore Ruth came with it. And really, it can go both ways. You had to buy Ruth in order to get the land. And yeah, it's just interesting discussions just come off of Ruth 4 here when you didn't think that there would be so much. And we have spent a lot of time going back and forth on these few verses. So
I think big picture here, something to point out is that Boaz is rich. He doesn't need to buy any more land. He doesn't need another field. But he is willing to buy the field and get the bride, and not just any bride, a Gentile bride. And so he, again, is being that picture of Jesus. Jesus doesn't need us. We need him. And Boaz is saying, I like you. Well, actually, maybe even I love you. And I'm going to do this for you because I love you.
Right.
Same thing Jesus does for us.
Exactly. That Jesus figure, that even the Gentile, like he came for everyone, not just the Israelites, not just that. And so that's why it's so important that he does use the language. It's not in there by mistake. He says Ruth the Moabite, because we have to see the importance of the fact that he does redeem a Gentile. You and I, as Gentiles, can also be redeemed.
And I think something that's also another like foreshadowing of this whole Jesus idea of Boaz being the Jesus figure or what Jesus would look like when he comes. We are having a land transfer here, and we are talking about the sandal being transferred back and forth. But also at the same time, when land was transacted or transferred, there would also be a deed that was written, and they would actually write two. One would go to the buyer, and one would be kept somewhere in the city as a backup. And they would just be like scrolls that were written on and rolled up and sealed. And in there then would be the names that were written, the stipulations, clauses, those kinds of things. And when you wanted to buy or redeem the land, you had to break the seal and unroll the scroll and claim the stipulations that the deed would fulfill. And so you had to be related in that family, you had to have the money, and you had to be willing. And if we then jump to Revelation 5, where John is taken to the second heaven in his vision, is that what he says? Don't quote what heaven, but he's taken in his vision to a vision of heaven. And in it, he sees a scroll that is rolled up and sealed, but no one is able to open it. And he starts weeping. And then one of the elders, which, I mean, we have elders here in this story, tells him not to be sad because the Lion of Judah has prevailed to take the scroll and loosen the seals, and then everyone is happy because that Redeemer is worthy of breaking the seals and opening the scrolls. So that's just another picture story of Jesus redeeming us and the earth through his ability of the things that were already laid out in Leviticus on how to be a redeemer. And so then how is he the redeemer? We see that he, in John 1 verses 1 and John 1:14, that he is related because he's fully God and he's fully man. And then 2, that he paid the price, the highest price. In Leviticus 17, you talk about how you atone for your sins or you pay for things with blood. And that's what Jesus does on the cross. And 3, you have willing. In John 10, 11 through 18, he talks about he came for everybody on the earth. So Jesus meets all the requirements of what you need to be the Redeemer. And Boaz is doing the same thing that Jesus did. We're just seeing this written out in the human story.
Right. And that's kind of that whole point where we talk about, look at the fact that there is more than just this beautiful love story. It's a love story for us too, and how foreshadowing that Jesus is going to do the same.
I like that. You're like, this is a love story for us too.
It is.
That's beautiful.
All right, so to keep going, we go to verse 11, and we have there that the elders and all of the people there say, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah. And who is Rachel and Leah? If you know your biblical history, they are the wives of Jacob, and they together have 13 children, which then encompasses being technically the mothers of the whole nation of Israel. So if you know of the 12 tribes of Israel, that is all their children. Why is it not 13, you may ask?
I am asking.
I had to look that up because I think people, myself included, are always like, yeah, they have 12 children. There was just a trivia night not that long ago where I got that wrong because I was like, yes, 12 tribes. But they had 13 children. We don't always count the tribe of Levi because the Levites had a special mission. They didn't own land and they were set apart for God. And so that's why it's not the 13. It's just the 12 tribes that is talked about.
When you say set apart for God, you mean set apart to be the priests?
Yes, they're the priests set apart for God.
All right, interesting. If you asked me, I would have said, yeah, they had 12 kids. Nope, they had 13.
Yeah.
I learned something every day.
I know. So that is who Rachel and Leah are. And obviously, when you think of the mothers of the whole nations, I mean, that's a massive population. And so that's where Rachel and Leah come from there. And that would be a huge blessing for them to have many children. And so it says, and they built up the family of Israel. And then may you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like Perez, whom Tamar bore at Judah. What an interesting little ending there to put them in there.
Right, because Tamar and Judah was tumultuous. I even think the Rachel and Leah story is tumultuous.
That is true. I mean, yes, I mean, this is supposed to be a blessing. And yet you have, if you know that whole story, where he wants to marry Rachel, he loves Rachel, and he gets Leah instead, has children with her, pays his time and work to get Rachel, which he's rewarded, and he gets her and has many sons too. But this other story is even more wild.
And we did touch on it a little bit before about how Tamar basically has to pretend to be a prostitute to sleep with her father-in-law to have this son because Judah doesn't give her his third son because the previous two had already died. And so, yeah, these are supposed to be blessings, but these stories are very tumultuous. And I think what's also interesting about the Tamar and Judah story is that then she goes on to have twins, Perez and Zerah. And what happens in the birth is that Zerah initially sticks his hand out that he's going to be the firstborn. So they tie the red cord or the red string around his wrist or arm, and then he pulls it back in, and then Perez bursts forth, which is actually what his name means, is to burst forth. And he is actually born before the other twin, making him the patriarch. And it's this like breach of birth, this breach of the plan, and kind of talking about how that also how Jesus is interrupting what we think the plan is. And then Jesus is like, nope, I have this better plan.
I think also interesting to end with that because we have that story there where Tamar is not being represented in the Levirate marriage law. And that's why she takes matters into her own hands. And so it does tie that up well, too, in the fact that we see that potentially taking place up there. And down here, that's why she takes matters into her own hands, because he refuses to let her marry the third son because the second one died by not honoring her in that law. And so then the third one, he's like, no, don't touch him because I'll lose all my children. And so she tricks him, gets pregnant, and here we have Perez. And so it is pretty neat to see this all tied up, though, with the blessing and that people want well for her, that they have now accepted her. Boaz is able to marry her, and people say, we want well for you. And I think that's a really cool way to tie up this whole passage. It was completely different from the beginning of the story, but we see God work through all of this, and it ends in a great positive way. And so then next week, we get to tie it all up. And we get to see this whole big plan and how exciting it is that God, from the very beginning, knew exactly what he was doing with Ruth. And we get to see, obviously, amazing things. So
stay tuned next week to see how the story ends. This episode was recorded at the Star Media Podcasting Suite in downtown Laverne, Minnesota. If you would like more information about Star Media, please see our show notes for details. Thanks for joining us on Wit and the Word, where we explore how meaning, context, and language shape our understanding of Scripture. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a conversation. Until next time, keep your wit sharp and your words full of life-giving encouragement, hope, love, and truth.